Hey, I'm Trey. Most police officers know that the majority of victims of violent crime happen due to trust. Trusting people that you don't truly know can kill you. Today's story is about a killer that was nicknamed the Rambo. Enjoy stories about serial killers spanning across centuries and countries? Then this is the channel for you. So click that button so you can be reminded of new content that I upload every Tuesday and Thursday. Please leave any comments or suggestions in the comment section because I'm always interested. Well, if you're ready, let's get started. Louis Poirson was born 1962 in the country of Madagascar. He had 3 siblings, all of which were females. His mother was a native of Madagascar and his father was a French national. The entire family relocated to France. Because he was the only son, his father was very abusive towards him. Louis alleged that his father drank alcohol regularly, and whenever he did, he can expect to be beaten by him for the slightest of reasons. His mother was described as a very passive woman. During his beatings, Louis stated that his mother would stand there and watch him be punished. This infuriated Louis. He always looked towards his mother for her help to intervene during the abuse, but he never received any help from her.
Thanks for nothing, Ma. I love you too.
This allowed Louis to harbor feelings of resentment towards his mother and father. Based on what Louis has said, you can't blame him for these feelings. To have an alcoholic as a father that was excessively abusive towards him, and a mother who looked the other way as he cried tears and pled for her help. Based on his statements, his hatred for his parents was at least understandable. No other information was provided on his youth, but as an adult, he earned his sailor license. Afterwards, he found work as a crewman on a boat that would journey up and down the Rhine River. He was well admired by his co-workers, which they unanimously said Louis was always extremely hard-working and he took his job seriously. At some point, Louis joined the army, but only stayed for a short period of time. In 1983, a string of sexual assaults had been taking place in the general area. Each victim stated that an unknown man would follow them until they got into a secluded location. That man would either produce a weapon and threaten the victim with that weapon if she did not comply with his demands, or that man would physically assault the woman and then physically remove her from that location to a more secluded location, and then each victim would have been raped. These sexual assaults took place over the course of a year. In each case, the victims were unable to see their attacker's face due to the actor instructing each victim to look away. The actor also took care at keeping his face hidden from them. Police located a total of 7 women that were attacked. None of the victims' names were provided, but the last victim was able to identify the license plate off of the vehicle that the actor used when he left. That plate number led back to Louis. Now fearing that his capture was inevitable, he remained under the radar in order to hide from the authorities. In January of 1985, he was captured. He went to trial, lost, and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Louis wasn't the type of person who learned from his bad choices. As a matter of fact, he wouldn't accept responsibility for any of his crimes. It could be inferred from what I found that he doubled down on his feelings. He believed that the world was responsible for his choices.
Later in the story, you'll see how he harnessed this feeling along with everything that he learned to become an even more exceptional killer.
Police officers tend to see this behavior quite often. Criminals tend to look at the world as if they are the victims, as if they didn't ask for the pain that was administered, so they shouldn't be held accountable for their crimes or actions. During his time in prison, he met and corresponded with a woman with 6 children, all of which were girls. I'm sorry, but for the life of me, I'll never understand why someone would build a relationship with a person in prison for being a serial rapist and you have 6 children, all of which are girls.
That's just great. If he doesn't assault your daughters, he'll make an excellent role model.
9.5 years later, Louis was released in the year of 1995. While he was out, he found work as a stonemason on the outskirts of Paris. Even though he was now out of prison, he continued to carry his anger towards the world with him. This rage would ultimately drive him to the next stage of his degeneration. Being a stonemason is difficult work, especially in the warmer months. This one particular day, he chose to go to a little cafe, have a drink of some wine, and just try to relax. He chose the most peaceful atmosphere that he could find in the general area. The cafe that he chose seemed to be isolated and had very few customers. He took a seat and requested a drink from the waiter.
Unbeknownst to him, this would be the day that he transforms into the savage that he kept locked inside of himself.
Almost immediately after he got his drink, he heard this dog in the nearby distance continuously barking. He tried to ignore it and hoped that it would just stop just as fast as it started. Unfortunately, it did not. As the minutes continued, he found himself feeling more and more annoyed of this dog barking. That little annoyance feeling evolved into anger. The next thing he knows, he found himself searching for where the noise was coming from. A short distance away was a pet cemetery. That's where the noise was coming from. Lewis found himself walking in that direction, following the noise of the barking dog. Eventually, the dog discontinued barking, and Lewis found himself in the middle of a pet cemetery, still enraged. Lewis then felt that in order for him to feel better and actually come down from feeling so angry, he needed to seek revenge. So he just stopped walking and just stood there looking for some way to make himself feel better. A short distance away, he noticed a tool shed that was locked. Lewis then went to the tool shed, smashed the window, and then stole a tool. Lewis had intentions on using that tool that he just stole to demolish some of the graves as a form of revenge due to him being annoyed by this mystery barking dog. At the same time, and several feet away, two women who were mother and daughter by the name of Janine and Monique Vivian went to pay respects to the grave of their dog. They were both kneeling when they overheard the smashing of the window by Lewis. Lewis had not observed the two women watching him at the time. As soon as they heard this, they stood up and observed Lewis when he stole the tool out of the shed. At some point, Monique assumed that this strange guy was a thief. She felt like she couldn't just stand by and do nothing. Unfortunately, Monique did a brave but foolish thing that would alter the trajectory of herself and her mother's life. Monique then stood up and threatened to contact the authorities if he did not put back the tools that he stole and immediately go away. Lewis allowed his anger to take over. He then charged both women, striking the mother, and then he beat up Monique. Lewis then forced both victims into their car along with himself. Lewis took the keys from Monique and drove the two women to a nearby isolated field. When the car was turned off, Lewis told them both that if they promised to keep their mouth shut about the incident, he would allow them to leave. At that moment, Monique did the last thing she would ever do with her life. She basically told him to screw himself and that she was definitely going to go to the authorities and report this incident. At this point, Lewis was too far gone with his rage. He immediately took a plastic bag and smothered Monique to death as her mother watched, screamed, and pled for her daughter's life. Immediately after Monique's death, he focused on the mother. He then broke Vivian's neck by striking her in the head full force with a wooden board. Now shocked at what he just did to these two poor women, he had to figure out a way to get rid of the bodies. Lewis came up with an idea to get some gasoline, then burn the vehicle and the bodies. He first needed to get some gas, and he knew where to go. He then decided on going to his current job in order to get the gas, because most, if not all, of the employees that he worked with that day should have been gone by now. After getting the gas, Lewis then drove the bodies to an isolated area, dumped them, and set them on fire. The car was then driven away and dumped on the outskirts of Paris, but this was not before it was set on fire as well. The following day, the authorities were notified of both the recovered burned bodies and the vehicle. Lewis was found to have had an unfortunate streak of luck. The victim's son and brother, Michael Vivian, was blamed for the murders, but the police arrested, charged, and found him guilty. Lewis realized how easy it was to get away with murder, so he decided to continue with his reign of terror.
Why would he stop now? He already sold his soul to the devil.
A year later, under unexplained circumstances, Lewis happened to be operating a vehicle on an isolated part of a highway. He encountered 3 female hitchhikers who all happened to be in their teens. Being young and naive, I'm sure they assumed that there was nothing wrong with catching a ride with Lewis. Unfortunately, their assumptions were way off course. He somehow kidnapped all 3 and tied them up in an isolated location. I'm sure his plan was to rape each one and probably kill them, but the girls were smart enough to break out of their bondages before becoming victims and escaped. The 3 girls immediately notified the authorities. Lewis was ultimately arrested and charged for the crime. He was ultimately found guilty and sentenced to 3 years in prison. Now more angry than ever, he continued to blame the world for his misfortunes.
He was probably thinking like, now how can I feel better about myself? I got it. I'll just play the victim and then kill somebody.
Lewis believed that the universe owed him a debt and he planned to reclaim it somehow. He was released from prison in July of 1998. A year later, Lewis was driving on a nearby road and he observed a 73-year-old female by the name of Lucy Pham Biche. She just so happened to be under the care of a nurse aide and resided in a nearby retirement home. Lucy was also suffering from dementia. She more than likely just wandered out of the nursing home. When Lewis saw this disoriented woman walking alongside of the road, he saw an opportunity to be the person that he was, a rapist killer. Lewis offered her a ride and she unknowingly accepted it. Lewis was searching for an isolated location in order to probably rape and kill this poor woman. I'm sure that she didn't realize that the decision she made to get into this car would cost her her life. At some point during the trip, the woman informed Lewis that she needed to urinate. Annoyed by this, Lewis pulled over in an isolated area and then Lucy exited the car. At that point, she realized that she had already urinated on herself while she was in the vehicle. Lewis became enraged and then slammed the defenseless, elderly, and senile woman on the ground. Immediately after, he picked her up and threw her back into the passenger seat of the vehicle. Lewis took the woman to his job when no one was working, and then he violently pulled her back out of the vehicle. Lewis then strangled her to death and buried her in a far corner of the lot. Over the next 2 years, Lewis was involved with 2 additional abductions that possibly involved rapes, one of which was murder. The second victim escaped and the authorities were notified. Lewis was eventually apprehended by the authorities and interviewed. During the proceedings, Lewis chose to explain in detail what he did to each victim and for what causes. Lewis was ultimately charged for 4 murders and 5 rapes. He went to trial and was found guilty. Lewis was sentenced to life imprisonment. If you enjoy more stories such as these, click the suggested video above. I upload new content every Tuesday and Thursday. God bless and stay safe.